Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're tackling a massive question. How do you build a nation from the ground up, especially after decades of colonial rule? We're going to look at three very different ways it was tried.
So picture this, the 1960s. It was just this explosion of change across Africa. The old colonial maps were basically torn up, and dozens of new countries were born, all at once facing this incredible challenge of figuring out how to govern themselves.
I mean, really think about that. The colonial flags come down, new ones go up, and then what? Where do you even start when the old system is gone and the future is a totally blank slate?
Okay, let's get right into it. To really understand the different roads these new nations went down, we first have to talk about what they were all handed at the starting line, the very complicated legacy of colonialism. You have to understand, the whole colonial economy was basically a one-way street. It was never, ever designed to benefit the people living there. Its entire purpose was to extract cheap stuff like cotton or copper and send it back to Europe to make someone else rich.
And politically, the way things were run was by force, not by debate. And then you get to this number, which is just mind-blowing. When the Congo became independent, a nation of 14 million people, it had only 14 university graduates. 14. How are you supposed to run a modern country with that?
So our first story takes us to Tanzania and to a leader with a really bold new idea, Julius Nyerere. He was so admired as an intellectual that his people called him Mwalimu, which is Swahili for the teacher.
Nyerere's big idea was something called ujamaa. Think of it as a uniquely African version of socialism. It wasn't about copying the Soviet Union. It was about tapping into traditional ideas of family, community, and working together to build a nation that didn't need to depend on anyone else.
And he put this whole vision down on paper in something called the Arusha Declaration. This wasn't just a policy paper. It was a radical plan to completely remake society, from taking over the banks to moving millions of people into new collective villages. And here's where it gets really complicated, because you can't just call it a success or a failure. On one hand, you had these incredible social gains. National unity was strong, illiteracy plummeted. But on the other hand, the economy was a disaster. Forcing people onto collective farms backfired, food production collapsed, and ironically, the country that wanted to be self-reliant ended up needing more foreign aid than ever. Okay, so that was the idealist's path. Now let's take a hard turn and look at something completely different. We're heading to the massive, mineral-rich Congo, which would soon be known as Zaire, under the rule of a man named Mobutu Sese Seko.
See, with Mobutu, there wasn't some grand vision for the people. His rise to power was all about chaos, dirty politics, and the Cold War. After the country's first elected leader, Patrice Lumumba, was assassinated, Mobutu, the army chief, just swept in and took over, with a quiet nod from Western powers who saw him as an ally.
Mobutu didn't really try to build a new system. Nah, he just perfected the art of theft. There's a word for it, kleptocracy. It literally means rule by thieves. And the entire country of Zaire? That became his personal piggy bank.
And the amount of money we're talking about, it's just staggering. An estimated $5 billion. To put that in perspective, that was about the same amount as his country's entire foreign debt. He basically stole the equivalent of everything the nation owed.
And you might be wondering, how did he get away with it? Well, the Cold War. As his personal fortune ballooned, the country's debt just exploded. But for the West, he was their guy against communism in Africa, so the international loans just kept on coming, no questions asked. So let's just pause for a second and put these two stories right next to each other, Tanzania and Zaire. Because the contrast, well, it tells you everything about the power of leadership.
At the end of the day, you have two totally opposite results. In Tanzania, you have the idealist, who sacrificed his country's economy for his vision of social unity. And in Zaire, you have the kleptocrat, who sacrificed his entire country for his own wallet, leaving nothing but ruin behind.
But what if the choice isn't even yours to make? What happens when a country's future is hijacked by forces way beyond its control? Well, that, tragically, is the story of our third case, Angola.
See, in Angola, when the Portuguese colonizers just up and left in 1975, it didn't lead to a new government. It created a massive power vacuum. And you know what rushes into a vacuum? The world's biggest superpowers.
And just like that, Angola's civil war wasn't really Angola's anymore. It became a chessboard for the Cold War. You had the Soviets and Cubans backing one side, and the US and apartheid South Africa arming and funding the other sides. It was a total proxy war, fought by Angolans on Angolan soil.
And the result? One of the longest, bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century. Over 1 million people dead. 1 million civilians. Their lives weren't lost for the future of Angola. They were pawns in a global game being played in Washington and Moscow.
Okay, so after hearing these 3 stories, so different and honestly so tragic, what are the big takeaways? What did these histories really teach us about the challenge of building a nation?
You have to remember the incredible hope they all started with. Just listen to this quote from Patrice Lumumba, Congo's first prime minister. You can feel the passion, the determination to prove they could do it themselves. But that hope, it ran into a brick wall of reality.
So what's the bottom line? It's that there's no single simple answer. The fate of these brand new countries was this incredibly messy combination of individual leaders' choices, the heavy baggage left by colonialism, and of course, the massive pressures of global politics.
Which leaves us with one last, tough question. The stories of Tanzania, Zaire, and Angola remind us that getting your independence, winning your freedom, well, that's just step 1. The journey to actually build a stable, prosperous nation is a long, difficult, and sometimes heartbreakingly uncertain road.